If you're old enough now to have a memory of watching Donald Rumsfeld as the Secretary of State for Defense back in February of 2002, giving a press briefing in anticipation of the start of, I think it might have been called the Second Gulf War, but anyway, going into Iraq for the second time, in recent history anyhow. And this was something which was not only hotly anticipated, but almost wished for by a lot of people, and I'll admit, including myself, because there was an element of wanting revenge, and even there was consternation at why it hadn't been enacted already, kind of thing, due to a certain event that had happened 5 months prior to this speech that he gave. Now, if you know what I'm talking about, you may already remember how convoluted his words sounded as he involved us in the sort of anticipatory stages of what the Department of Defense knew about what it would be like when we got to Iraq, and how it would go, and what they knew about what it would be like before we got there, and what they knew they didn't know until we did get there. So even if you were around to see his statement to the assembled media on TV the first time around, let me remind you of exactly what he said, because I've gone back to listen to it again and write down the words exactly as he said them. He said, "There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know." So if you were like me, you probably rolled your eyes at his apparently self-contradictory and nonsensical language, and wondered, but maybe not too intently, how yet another buffoon had been put in charge of such an important public office. But, you know, that was obviously the folly of youth, I'm going to say, in my day. I thought I was a lot cleverer than I was. I thought I was a lot more intelligent and capable than I was. And I probably even said to myself something worse than, oh, I would be able to do a much better job than he did. So how wrong I was, and how ridiculous a statement something like that is, for so many reasons. But I'm just admitting that up front, so you don't think that I'm saying that I'm any better than anybody else in this regard. I can actually see how much guilt that I carry, not by having done anything particularly, but by just having thought these thoughts. I suppose an examination of what it means for a lot of people to be thinking the same thing, and what it creates in the world, is a philosophical matter for another day. But for now, I'm going to try and just concentrate on the subject matter I intended with this here, which is to examine this idea, one particular idea that springs out of these known knowns. So I don't think he was a buffoon at all. I think he was deliberately and consciously sending us messages with many meanings on different wavelengths, and I think he was also giving us an insight into the kind of phrases that flew around within the corridors of his workplace, and which formed the culture and the thinking inside the walls of the buildings where he worked. Now, all of this is something I would like to analyse in much greater detail, especially the unknown unknowns part. And I really want to come back to that, because I think there are some fascinating insights to be had into the way that all human minds think. But for now, I want to focus on the question of known knowns. What are the things we know, and how did we come to know them? In other words, how do we learn things, and how do we actually know anything? What is it that we think we mean when we say we know something? So I'm going to make an assertion now and leave it standing as something that either seems self-evident to you or not, and perhaps another time I'll really pull it apart and examine it and provide an explanation for why I say this. But for now, here it is, just unvarnished. I don't think we can know anything unless we discover it for ourselves. So if your education has consisted largely or completely on listening to what you were told, absorbing it, and being able to recall it and repeat it under certain conditions, you know, like a test or an examination of how well you listened and are able to remember what you were told, then unfortunately I think you know little to nothing at all. Now, the point here is not to insult you, and if you have felt yourself getting a little hot under the collar at hearing this, then you must understand that this is not a healthy reaction, because it means that you're having an emotional reaction in a situation where not only is it not necessary, but having this reaction is detrimental to your ability to actually learn, or to be pointed in the direction where you could learn at least. What I'm dancing around here now anyway is the subject of epistemology, which is a bit of a high concept only in the sense that it's an abstraction upon an abstraction, or an abstraction about an abstraction. It's an idea about an idea. Now, if this is sounding a bit Inception-like, then you're thinking exactly along the right lines, because, it is circles around circles, or worlds within worlds. And to touch on a touchy subject, it's a bit like stalling on the starting blocks because of an issue which immediately presents itself to you when you want to examine the shape of the world you live in. In order to do that, you must step outside of it first. And not only that, you must place yourself outside of its frame of reference. And in doing so, you have no idea if your perception outside of the reality which shaped it can even be guaranteed to be valid when you place yourself outside of it and separate from it. Epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge. It may itself be a subject matter that fails before it even gets off the starting blocks, because it poses the same immediate reciprocal problem, which is, how can we know anything about knowing using the same processes by which we think we know things? So I'm sure there's probably some great Chinese proverb that encapsulates this, some Confucius type saying that will get across this meaning much better than the examples that I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. But it's not the one hand clapping thing, I don't think, that I'm thinking of. But what was occurring to me was things like, can a knife cut itself? Can a vacuum cleaner vacuum itself? Can water absorb itself? Can fire burn itself? But you get the idea. And I think maybe you could probably think of a better divide by itself, or maybe it's a divide by zero example. Now, what I always feel is best, if a problem seems to be insurmountable, if you're actually going to try tackling it rather than just put it to your subconscious, which is probably the best thing to do. But once you've done that, and if you've put it to your subconscious and slept on it a few nights, and nothing has popped from your subconscious into your conscious mind, then perhaps the best thing to do, when you can't even get over the first hurdle because you're having immediate issues defining what exactly a hurdle is, never mind the word is itself, is to break down a word into syllables and see if we can discover its actual real meaning. And then at least we might have a place to start from. So if I take the word epistemology, I've been deliberately pronouncing it as epistemology rather than epistemology, because I think the word breaks down into three main smaller syllables, and the first one is epi. And I haven't cheated by looking these up. I've just thought of other words containing these kind of syllables and asked myself what they mean and divined their meaning that way. I want to explain what I'm doing here by saying that this is a process of discovery for me, and I may be wrong, and I'm not saying that I am absolutely correct in anything I say here. And the proviso is always to please not only feel free to go and do your research, but please, never forget to check that whatever I'm saying is true and accurate. And I'm certainly not trying to deceive anybody or to convince anybody of anything. I'm just honestly, legitimately, truthfully trying to share what it is that I think I know, or at the very least my thought process is, and my rationale in getting to a place where I think I've established something that seems true. All right. So with that said, anyway, epi, from what I can gather anyway, it's derived from a Greek word and it may not even be a full Greek word in itself, but anyhow, it comes from Greek, and it seems to mean something like an outer layer or an outer shell. And we use it meaning that, something that's outside or on top of something, but an outer portion of something. So we use it as a prefix, and something that goes before. I don't know how many words we have, but I can think of at least two now anyway, other than epistemology. So I thought of epicenter, especially in relation to earthquakes. So an epicenter is something outside of the center point where the tectonic plates moved, or where the central portion of the force was, where there was a snapping. So this is like a circle that has radiated out from this center point. So that's an epicenter. And epidermis is the outer layer of skin that you have on your body, and so the dermis part is referring to the skin. So it's outside of the skin, or outer layer of the skin, and the dermis part is where we get words like dermatology, meaning the study of skin, I suppose, but we take it to mean skin care, but you can't know how to care for your skin unless you've studied how to do it. So that ology part, meaning study, is of course in the epistemology, and I'll get to that in a minute, but not before stem, the middle syllable. We don't even have to go back to Greek or Latin to say it's just a word we probably took right from those languages and made into English, and it's either the green stalk of a flower, from which the flower grows. And I'm not being facetious or overly simplistic here. I think there's no need to make something more complicated than it is when it's staring us in the face like this. So no need to do any extra work on this one. If a flower is grown and beautiful and open and in full bloom, then I'm going to say that's maybe like the radiance of knowledge on top of this stem. And if the stem is that thing from which the knowledge has grown, then we hope that its roots are planted in something solid and enriching. If a flower could be bigger, it could grow into something where the stem is not actually green. And I think just the difference between a pebble and a stone and a rock, I don't think anybody knows at what diameter one turns into the next. But there's a certain thickness and a certain rigidity or a certain toughness where a plant's stem will turn into a tree trunk and a bark, and the bark is the epidermis of the tree. And then if the crown of the tree then containing all its branches, these are all the different branches of knowledge. They're all interconnected in a way, but they're different subject matters. So is this as obvious as the biblical tree of knowledge is that the fruit was eaten from? I think so, and I think that's where the metaphor probably originates. And I think another little truism, another axiom I'm going to state here now is that there seems to be a golden rule here. Maybe I'll say a golden and silver rule in this reality. You can't understand things in only one aspect or point of view. You can't understand everything in only literal terms, and metaphor mightn't seem to translate very well all the time into practical matters. But I think just like the left hand and the right hand, like the two hemispheres of the brain, you can't understand things in a cold clinical sense without understanding a sort of poetic and allegorical sense to something as well. So I think the tree of knowledge is both a figurative thing and a literal thing. All right, well, I'll move on now to the third syllable in the word epistemology. And ology, I'm reasonably confident without looking it up, doesn't just mean the study of something. I think we can break it down a bit further. I think ology comes from the word logos in Greek, which is simultaneously the word for truth and the word for word. And you can prove this to yourself if you look up I can't remember the chapter and verse, but it's a Genesis quote anyway, saying that in the beginning there was the word. But in the Greek version of that, King James translation, it says something like in arche, in logos. I've maybe skipped out a word or two there, but what it means is in the beginning there was logos, or out of the fire, perhaps it means there was logos. And I don't think it just means there was the word or a word, because it immediately begs the question, well, what word was that? I think what it means is there was truth. And a word is just a sign or a symbol that can convey that truth. So truth and word here are interchangeable, but really you need to blend the two into one concept and say something about the truthfulness of language, perhaps, or the way that we convey something in a truthful manner, or how we study things through language and derive truth from that. So I think that's a more rounded explanation of what ology is, not just the study of something, but to try and find the heart of the truth of the matter through the medium of language. Maybe the O-logy, rather than just logos, means or serves to indicate something along the lines of that we're taking meaning from it. I'd say that even if I'm not 100% accurate here, that I'm along the right lines and close enough. So if I put these three things together now and breaking it down, we have a meaning that we've derived from each syllable of the word epistemology. It's like a mathematical equation where you have to kind of break each variable down a bit, and it's going to look messy then before you put it back together again. So epistemology now means something like from an outside position, perhaps an orbital or circular position, of the source of the truth. I've put in source. So, studying knowledge, the term epistemology is more than that. It means trying to get at the truth of the words that we use to convey what we know from a position outside of those words or around them. And maybe the notion of a circle means that you could traverse the circumference of this circle and try and look back at those words from different positions on that circle. So what we're trying to understand anyway is not just how we know things, but how we know the truth of those things. So we're examining the veracity of the sum total of our knowledge, because epistemology is not just testing whether the things that we think we know is true, but trying to figure out whether the methods that we use to determine the truth of what we know is itself valid. It's a pretty tall order, I think. So anyway, this technique that I'm using to disassemble words is something that I think that I've done pretty successfully to help me understand a lot of the words that I use and a lot of the words that I use to think thoughts. And it's helped me get a clearer understanding and a sharper focus on my own thoughts. And not only have I been able to do it in English, but I've been able to do it to my surprise and delight in other languages like French and maybe, in German as well, and in Greek and in Latin. And by the way, don't get me wrong here, I'm not trying to say that I am somebody who is proficient at these languages. I'm not trying to claim that I'm a scholar. I'm certainly not trying to... What I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to speak to you from a position of authority. I'm not claiming anything because I say I know it and it must be true because I've studied these things or I've got a qualification in these things. I don't. And not only that, but if I did, you shouldn't believe me if I say, hey, this is the way it is, this is true, this is what's what, because I'm a scholar of these things. No, you should only believe anybody if they're able to provide a rationale, an explanation that's coherent, that takes you from one small step to the next, and that there's no little tricky manoeuvres between those steps, so that it all hangs together nicely and truthfully and honestly, and that there's no agenda. Now, as I've said to you as an aside in one of the previous videos that I made here on this channel, I know you can trust me, but you don't know that. And I think the only way that you should trust me is that if over time you've seen that I'm consistent in the things that I say and that there doesn't appear to be any agenda or motive for me to mislead you, then maybe you can place more of your trust in me. But what I'm trying to say to you is that you shouldn't place your trust in anybody and what they say immediately. And I wish that we could, because then I think it would be easier to just get on with exploration of things without having to have a preamble and a backtrack like I'm doing now to talk about a foundational concept that I shouldn't even have to get into. But I think, it's early days in this channel. And at least maybe this way I can set out my particular motivation clearly, set out the way that I'd like things to go, and also have something then to refer back to in the future, whereby if anybody says to me, hey, why should we believe anything you say? I can maybe say, well, look, I could give you a at-length explanation, but I've already kind of addressed it and refer them back to what I'm just saying now. So we'll see how this holds up in a few months, in a few years. Time and maybe even beyond. But I'll round this out for now by saying that this technique is something that I'm going to use again and again, and I thought that what better word to use as an example to disassemble and demonstrate the method than the word epistemology itself. And it might, coincidentally, this method help to settle debates about how any certain word should be pronounced, because by breaking them into their component syllables, you may at least be able to provide a rationale as to why you might think that your pronunciation makes sense, or better sense than the way somebody else is pronouncing it. Because, with this word epistemology, you often hear people saying epistemology. And, it's not that... Well, I suppose I don't really like the sound of that way of stressing the syllables, but I think that objectively it's not correct, because I think when you say epistemology, you're splitting the syllables incorrectly. You're taking one letter from one syllable and giving it to another syllable where it doesn't belong, but I think you get what I'm saying. But maybe it would be more obvious if I wrote it down on screen and split it different ways. It could be something that is visually more understandable than having to imagine it in your head as I say it. But if I'm right that the components are epi, stem and ology, then objectively epistemology is correct. Perhaps there is no one true way, best way, correct way of saying something, but if there is, that's my argument or case for it. But primarily I just wanted to establish this principle, this method of dissection of words in any language as a foundational concept that I can refer back to perhaps many times again in the future without having to reintroduce it or recreate it from scratch. So I suppose what I'm doing now, it's a bit like building a foundation. I'm making a mould for a brick so that I can make many more bricks from it in the future, perhaps.